This sound file contains the spoken version of a Wikipedia article on Hamlet, recorded by user CarlTalk. The material recorded is current as of the 15th of October 2011. The tragical history of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, or more simply Hamlet, is a tragedy by William Shakespeare, believed to have been written between 1599 and 1601. The play, set in the Kingdom of Denmark, recounts how Prince Hamlet exacts revenge on his uncle Claudius, firstly for murdering the old King Hamlet, Claudius's brother and Prince Hamlet's father, and secondly for then succeeding to the throne and marrying Gertrude, the King Hamlet's widow and mother of Prince Hamlet. The play vividly portrays real and feigned madness, from overwhelming grief to seething rage, and explores themes of treachery, revenge, incest, and moral corruption. 3 different early versions of the play have survived. These are known as the first quarto, Q1, the second quarto, Q2, and the first folio, F1. Each has lines and even scenes that are missing from the others. Shakespeare based Hamlet on the legend of Amleth, preserved by 13th century chronicler Saxo Grammaticus in his Gesta Danorum, as subsequently retold by 16th century scholar François de Belforêt. He may have also drawn on, or perhaps written, an earlier, hypothetical Elizabethan play, known today as the Hamlet. The play's structure and depth of characterization have inspired much critical scrutiny, of which one example is the centuries-old debate about Hamlet's hesitation to kill his uncle. Some see it as a plot device to prolong the action, and others see it as the result of pressure exerted by the complex philosophical and ethical issues that surround cold-blooded murder, calculated revenge, and thwarted desire. More recently, psychoanalytic critics have examined Hamlet's unconscious desires, and feminist critics have reevaluated and rehabilitated the often maligned characters of Ophelia and Gertrude. Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest play, and among the most powerful and influential tragedies in the English language. It has a story capable of, quote, seemingly endless retelling and adaptation by others, end quote. During Shakespeare's lifetime, the play was one of his most popular works, and it still ranks high among his most performed, topping, for example, what eventually became the Royal Shakespeare Company's list since 1879. It has inspired writers from Goethe and Dickens to Joyce and Murdoch, and has been described as, quote, the world's most filmed story after Cinderella, end quote. The title role was almost certainly created for Richard Burbage, the leading tragedian of Shakespeare's time. In the 400 years since, it has been performed by highly acclaimed actors and actresses from each successive age. The introduction is accompanied by an image with the caption, the American actor Edwin Booth as Hamlet, circa 1870. The article contains 12 sections, which are as follows. 1. Characters. 2. Plot. 3. Sources. 4. Date. 5. Texts. 6. Analysis and criticism. 7. Context and interpretation. 8. Influence. 9. Performance history. 10. Stage pastiches. 11. References. 12. External links. Section 1. Characters. Hamlet, son of the former king and nephew of the present king. Claudius, king of Denmark, Hamlet's uncle. Gertrude, queen of Denmark and mother to Hamlet. Polonius, Lord Chamberlain. Ophelia, daughter to Polonius. Horatio, friend to Hamlet. Laertes, son to Polonius. Voltimand, Cornelius, courtiers. Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, courtiers, friends to Hamlet. Osric, a courtier. Marcellus, an officer. Bernardo, an officer. Francisco, a soldier. Rinaldo, servant to Polonius. Ghost of Hamlet's father. Fortinbras, Prince of Norway. Gravediggers, a sexton and a clown. Player king, player queen, Lucianus, etc. Players. Section 2. Plot. The protagonist of Hamlet is Prince Hamlet of Denmark, son of deceased King Hamlet and his wife, Queen Gertrude. The story opens on a chilly night at Elsinore, the Danish royal castle. Francisco, one of the sentinels, is relieved of his watch by Bernardo, another sentinel, and exits while Bernardo remains. A third sentinel, Marcellus, enters with Horatio, Hamlet's best friend. The sentinels inform Horatio that they have seen a ghost that looks like the dead King Hamlet. After hearing from Horatio of the ghost's appearance, Hamlet resolves to see the ghost himself. That night the ghost appears again. It leads Hamlet to a secluded place, claims that it is the actual spirit of his father, and discloses that he, the elder Hamlet, was murdered by Claudius's pouring poison in his ear. The ghost demands that Hamlet avenge him. Hamlet agrees, swears his companions to secrecy, and tells them he intends to, quote, put an antic disposition on, end quote, presumably to avert suspicion. Hamlet initially attests to the ghost's reliability, calling him both an honest ghost and true penny. Later, however, he expresses doubts about the ghost's nature and intent, claiming these as reasons for his inaction. Polonius is Claudius's trusted chief counselor. Polonius's son, Laertes, is returning to France, and Polonius's daughter, Ophelia, is courted by Hamlet. Both Polonius and Laertes warn Ophelia that Hamlet is surely not serious about her. Shortly afterward, Ophelia is alarmed by Hamlet's strange behavior, reporting to her father that Hamlet rushed into her room, stared at her, and said nothing. Polonius assumes that the ecstasy of love is responsible for Hamlet's mad behavior, and he informs Claudius and Gertrude. Perturbed by Hamlet's continuing deep mourning for his father and his increasingly erratic behavior, Claudius sends for two of Hamlet's acquaintances, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to find out the cause of Hamlet's changed behavior. Hamlet greets his friends warmly, but quickly discerns that they have been sent to spy on him. Together, Claudius and Polonius convince Ophelia to speak with Hamlet while they secretly listen. When Hamlet enters, she offers to return his remembrances, upon which Hamlet questions her honesty and furiously rants at her to get thee to a nunnery. Hamlet remains uncertain whether the ghost has told him the truth, but the arrival of a troupe of actors at Elsinore presents him with a solution. He will have them stage a play, The Murder of Gonzago, reenacting his father's murder, and determine Claudius's guilt or innocence by studying his reaction to it. The court assembles to watch the play. Hamlet provides an agitated running commentary throughout. When the murder scene is presented, Claudius abruptly rises and leaves the room, which Hamlet sees as proof of his uncle's guilt. Gertrude summons Hamlet to her closet to demand an explanation. On his way, Hamlet passes Claudius in prayer, but hesitates to kill him, reasoning that death in prayer would send him to heaven. However, it is revealed that the king is not truly praying, remarking that words never made it to heaven without thoughts. An argument erupts between Hamlet and Gertrude. Polonius, spying on the scene from behind an arras, and convinced that the prince's madness is indeed real, panics when it seems as if Hamlet is about to murder the queen and cries out for help. Hamlet, believing it is Claudius behind the arras, stabs wildly through the cloth, killing Polonius. When he realizes that he has killed Ophelia's father, he is not remorseful, but calls Polonius, quote, "Thou wretched, rash, intruding fool." End quote. The ghost appears, urging Hamlet to treat Gertrude gently, but reminding him to kill Claudius. Unable to see or hear the ghost herself, Gertrude takes Hamlet's conversation with it as further evidence of madness. Claudius, now fearing for his life, finds a legitimate excuse to get rid of the prince. He sends Hamlet to England on a diplomatic pretext, accompanied, and closely watched, by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Alone, Claudius discloses that he is actually sending Hamlet to his death. Prior to embarking for England, Hamlet hides Polonius's body, ultimately revealing its location to the king. Upon leaving Elsinore, Hamlet encounters the army of Prince Fortinbras en route to do battle in Poland. Upon witnessing so many men going to their death on the brash whim of an impulsive prince, Hamlet declares, quote, "Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody, or be nothing worth." End quote. At Elsinore, further demented by grief at her father Polonius's death, Ophelia wanders the castle, acting erratically and singing bawdy songs. Her brother, Laertes, returns from France, horrified by his father's death and his sister's madness. She appears briefly to give out herbs and flowers. Claudius convinces Laertes that Hamlet is solely responsible. Then news arrives that Hamlet is still alive. A story is spread that his ship was attacked by pirates on the way to England, and he has returned to Denmark. Claudius swiftly concocts a plot to kill his nephew, but make it appear to be an accident, taking all of the blame off his shoulders. Knowing of Hamlet's jealousy of Laertes' prowess with a sword, he proposes a fencing match between the two. Laertes, enraged at the murder of his father, informs the king that he will further poison the tip of his sword, so that a mere scratch would mean certain death. Claudius, unsure that capable Hamlet could receive even a scratch, plans to offer Hamlet poisoned wine if that fails. Gertrude enters to report that Ophelia has drowned. In the Elsinore churchyard, two clowns, typically represented as gravediggers, enter to prepare Ophelia's grave, and, although the coroner has ruled her death accidental so that she may receive Christian burial, they argue about its being a case of suicide. Hamlet arrives with Horatio and banters with one of them, who unearths the skull of a jester whom Hamlet once knew, Yorick. Quote, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio." Unquote. Ophelia's funeral procession approaches, led by her mournful brother Laertes. Diswrought at the lack of ceremony, due to the actually deemed suicide, and overcome by emotion, Laertes leaps into the grave, cursing Hamlet as the cause of her death. Hamlet interrupts, professing his own love and grief for Ophelia. He and Laertes grapple, but the fight is broken up by Claudius and Gertrude. Claudius reminds Laertes of the planned fencing match. Later that day, Hamlet tells Horatio how he escaped death on his journey, disclosing that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have been sent to their deaths instead. A courtier, Osric, interrupts to invite Hamlet to fence with Laertes. Despite Horatio's warnings, Hamlet accepts and the match begins. After several rounds, Gertrude toasts Hamlet, against the urgent warning of Claudius, accidentally drinking the wine he poisoned. Between bouts, Laertes attacks and pierces Hamlet with his poisoned blade. In the ensuing scuffle, Hamlet is able to use Laertes' own poisoned sword against him. Gertrude falls, and in her dying breath, announces that she has been poisoned. In his dying moments, Laertes is reconciled with Hamlet, and reveals Claudius's murderous plot. Hamlet stabs Claudius with the poisoned sword, and then forces him to drink from his own poisoned cup to make sure he dies. In his final moments, Hamlet names Prince Fortinbras of Norway as the probable heir to the throne, since the Danish kingship is an elected position, with the country's nobles having the final say. Horatio attempts to kill himself with the same poisoned wine, but is stopped by Hamlet, as he will be the only one left alive who can give a full account of the story. When Fortinbras arrives to greet King Claudius, he encounters the deadly scene. Gertrude, Claudius, Laertes, and Hamlet are all dead. Horatio asks to be allowed to recount the tale to, quote, "the yet unknowing world," unquote, and Fortinbras orders Hamlet's body borne off in honor. This section is accompanied by 3 images. The first is captioned, Horatio, Marcellus, Hamlet, and the Ghost, artist, Henry Fuseli, 1798. The second is captioned, The Gravedigger Scene, artist, Eugène Delacroix, 1839. The third is captioned, Hamlet avenged his father by killing his uncle, artist, Gustave Moreau, date unknown. Section 3. Sources. Hamlet-like legends are so widely found, for example in Italy, Spain, Scandinavia, Byzantium, and Arabia, that the core hero as fool theme is possibly Indo-European in origin. Several ancient written precursors to Hamlet can be identified. The first is the anonymous Scandinavian saga of Hrolf Kraki. In this, the murdered king has two sons, Hror and Helgi, who spend most of the story in disguise under false names, rather than feigning madness, in a sequence of events that differs from Shakespeare's. The second is the Roman legend of Brutus, recorded in two separate Latin works. Its hero, Lucius, shining, light, changes his name and persona to Brutus, dull, stupid, playing the role of a fool to avoid the fate of his father and brothers, and eventually slaying his family's killer, King Tarquinius. A 17th-century Nordic scholar, Torpheus, compared the Icelandic hero Amloti and the Spanish hero Prince Ambales from the Ambales saga to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Similarities include the prince's feigned madness, his accidental killing of the king's counselor in his mother's bedroom, and the eventual slaying of his uncle. Many of the earlier legendary elements are interwoven in the 13th century Vita Amlethi, the Life of Amleth, by Saxo Grammaticus, part of Gesta Danorum. Written in Latin, it reflects classical Roman concepts of virtue and heroism, and was widely available in Shakespeare's day. Significant parallels include the prince feigning madness, his mother's hasty marriage to the usurper, the prince killing a hidden spy, and the prince substituting the execution of two retainers for his own. A reasonably faithful version of Saxo's story was translated into French in 1570 by François de Belforêt in his Histoire tragique. Belforêt embellished Saxo's text substantially, almost doubling its length, and introduced the hero's melancholy. According to a popular theory, Shakespeare's main source is believed to be an earlier play, now lost, known today as the Hamlet, possibly written by Thomas Kyd or even William Shakespeare himself. The Hamlet would have been in performance by 1589, and the first version of the story known to incorporate a ghost. Shakespeare's company, the Chamberlain's Men, may have purchased that play and performed a version for some time, which Shakespeare reworked. Since no copy of the Hamlet has survived, however, it is impossible to compare its language and style with the known works of any of its putative authors. Consequently, there is no direct evidence that Kyd wrote it, nor any evidence that the play was not an early version of Hamlet by Shakespeare himself. This latter idea, placing Hamlet far earlier than the generally accepted date, with a much longer period of development, has attracted some support, though others dismiss it as speculation. The upshot is that scholars cannot assert with any confidence how much material Shakespeare took from the Hamlet, if it even existed, how much from Belforêt or Saxo, and how much from other contemporary sources, such as Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. No clear evidence exists that Shakespeare made any direct references to Saxo's version. However, elements of Belforét's version which are not in Saxo's story do appear in Shakespeare's play. Whether Shakespeare took these from Belforêt directly or through the Hamlet remains unclear. Most scholars reject the idea that Hamlet is in any way connected with Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet Shakespeare, who died in 1596 at age 11. Conventional wisdom holds that Hamlet is too obviously connected to legend, and the name Hamnet was quite popular at the time. However, Stephen Greenblatt has argued that the coincidence of the names and Shakespeare's grief for the loss of his son may lie at the heart of the tragedy. He notes that the name of Hamnet Sadler, the Stratford neighbor after whom Hamnet was named, was often written as Hamlet Sadler, and that, in the loose orthography of the time, the names were virtually interchangeable. Sadler's first name is spelled Hamlet with two T's in Shakespeare's will. Scholars have often speculated that Hamlet's Polonius might have been inspired by William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Lord High Treasurer and Chief Counselor to Queen Elizabeth I. E. K. Chambers suggested Polonius's advice to Laertes may have echoed Burleigh's to his son Robert Cecil. John Dover Wilson thought it almost certain that the figure of Polonius caricatured Burleigh, while A. L. Rouse speculated that Polonius's tedious verbosity might have resembled Burleigh's. Lillian Winstanley thought the name Corambus in the first quarto did suggest Cecil and Burleigh. Harold Jenkins criticized the idea of any direct personal satire as unlikely and uncharacteristic of Shakespeare, while G. R. Hibbard hypothesized that differences in names, Corambus/Polonius, Montano/Rinaldo, between the first quarto and other editions might reflect a desire not to offend scholars at Oxford University. This section is accompanied by two images. The first is captioned, "A Facsimile of Gesta Danorum by Saxo Grammaticus, which contains the legend of Amleth." The second is captioned, "Title page of The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kidd." Section 4. Date. Any dating of Hamlet must be tentative, cautions the New Cambridge editor, Philip Edwards. The earliest date estimate relies on Hamlet's frequent allusions to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, itself dated to mid-1599. The latest date estimate is based on an entry of 26th of July, 1602, in the Register of the Stationers' Company, indicating that Hamlet was, quote, "lately acted by the Low Chamberlain his servants." End quote. In 1598, Francis Mears published in his Palladis Tamia a survey of English literature from Chaucer to its present day, within which 12 of Shakespeare's plays are named. Hamlet is not among them, suggesting that it had not yet been written. As Hamlet was very popular, the New Swan series editor Bernard Lott believes it, quote, "unlikely that he, Mears, would have overlooked, so significant a piece." End quote. The phrase "little Iasses" in the first folio, F1, may allude to the Children of the Chapel, whose popularity in London forced the Globe Company into provincial touring. This became known as the War of the Theatres and supports a 1601 dating. A contemporary of Shakespeare's, Gabriel Harvey, wrote a marginal note in his copy of the 1598 edition of Chaucer's works, which some scholars use as dating evidence. Harvey's note says that the wiser sort enjoy Hamlet and implies that the Earl of Essex, executed in February 1601 for rebellion, was still alive. Other scholars consider this inconclusive. Edwards, for example, concludes that the, quote, "sense of time is so confused in Harvey's note that it is really of little use in trying to date Hamlet." End quote. This is because the same note also refers to Spencer and Watson as if they were still alive, quote, "our flourishing matricians," end quote, but also mentions, quote, "Owen's New Epigrams," end quote, published in 1607. Section 5. Texts. 3 early editions of the text have survived, making attempts to establish a single, authentic text problematic. Each is different from the others. First quarto, Q1. In 1603, the booksellers Nicholas Ling and John Trundle published, and Valentine Sims printed, the so-called bad first quarto. Q1 contains just over half of the text of the later second quarto. Second quarto, Q2. In 1604, Nicholas Ling published, and James Roberts printed, the second quarto. Some copies are dated 1605, which may indicate a second impression. Consequently, Q2 is often dated 1604/5. Q2 is the longest early edition, although it omits 85 lines found in F1, most likely to avoid offending James I's queen, Anne of Denmark. First Folio, F1. In 1623, Edward Blount and William and Isaac Jaggart published the First Folio, the first edition of Shakespeare's complete works. Other folios and quartos were subsequently published, including John Smethwick's Q3, Q4, and Q5, 1611 to 1637, but these are regarded as derivatives of the first three editions. Early editors of Shakespeare's works, beginning with Nicholas Rowe, 1709, and Louis Theobald, 1733, combined material from the two earliest sources of Hamlet available at the time, Q2 and F1. Each text contains material that the other lacks, with many minor differences in wording. Scarcely 200 lines are identical in the two. Editors have combined them in an effort to create one inclusive text that reflects an imagined ideal of Shakespeare's original. Theobald's version became standard for a long time, and his full-text approach continues to influence editorial practice to the present day. Some contemporary scholarship, however, discounts this approach, instead considering, quote, an authentic Hamlet an unrealizable ideal, ellipsis. There are texts of this play, but no text, unquote. The 2006 publication by Arden Shakespeare of different Hamlet texts in different volumes is perhaps the best evidence of this shifting focus and emphasis. Traditionally, editors of Shakespeare's plays have divided them into 5 acts. None of the early texts of Hamlet, however, were arranged this way, and the play's division into acts and scenes derives from a 1676 quarto. Modern editors generally follow this traditional division, but consider it unsatisfactory. For example, after Hamlet drags Polonius's body out of Gertrude's bedchamber, there is an act break, after which the action appears to continue uninterrupted. The discovery in 1823 of Q1, whose existence had been quite unsuspected, caused considerable interest and excitement, raising many questions of editorial practice and interpretation. Scholars immediately identified apparent deficiencies in Q1, which was instrumental in the development of the concept of a Shakespearean bad quarto. Yet Q1 has value. It contains stage directions that reveal actual stage practices in a way that Q2 and F1 do not. It contains an entire scene, usually labeled 4.6, that does not appear in either Q2 or F1, and it is useful for comparison with the later editions. The scene order is more coherent, without the problems of Q2 and F1 of Hamlet seeming to resolve something in one scene and enter the next drowning in indecision. This is a scene order many modern theatrical productions follow. The major deficiency of Q1 is that the language is not Shakespearean enough, particularly noticeable in the opening lines of the famous "To be or not to be" soliloquy. Quote, "To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream. Aye, marry, there it goes." End quote. Q1 is considerably shorter than Q2 or F1, and may be a memorial reconstruction of the play as Shakespeare's company performed it, by an actor who played a minor role, most likely Marcellus. Scholars disagree whether the reconstruction was pirated or authorized. Another theory, considered by New Cambridge editor Kathleen Irache, holds that Q1 is an abridged version intended especially for traveling productions. The idea that Q1 is not riddled with error, but is instead eminently fit for the stage, has led to at least 28 different Q1 productions since 1881. This section is accompanied by 2 images. The first is captioned, "Title page of the 1605 printing, Q2, of Hamlet." The second is captioned, "Comparison of the To Be or Not to Be soliloquy in the first 3 editions of Hamlet, showing the varying quality of the text in the bad quarto, the good quarto, and the first folio." Section 6. Analysis and Criticism. Section 6.1. Critical History. From the early 17th century, the play was famous for its ghost and vivid dramatization of melancholy and insanity, leading to a procession of mad courtiers and ladies in Jacobean and Caroline drama. Though it remained popular with mass audiences, late 17th century Restoration critics saw Hamlet as primitive and disapproved of its lack of unity and decorum. This view changed drastically in the 18th century, when critics regarded Hamlet as a hero, a pure, brilliant young man thrust into unfortunate circumstances. By the mid-18th century, however, the advent of Gothic literature brought psychological and mystical readings, returning madness and the ghost to the forefront. Not until the late 18th century did critics and performers begin to view Hamlet as confusing and inconsistent. Before then, he was either mad or not, either a hero or not, with no in-betweens. These developments represented a fundamental change in literary criticism, which came to focus more on character and less on plot. By the 19th century, Romantic critics valued Hamlet for its internal, individual conflict, reflecting the strong contemporary emphasis on internal struggles and inner character in general. Then, too, critics started to focus on Hamlet's delay as a character trait rather than a plot device. This focus on character and internal struggle continued into the 20th century, when criticism branched in several directions, discussed in context and interpretation below. Section 6.2. Dramatic Structure. Hamlet departed from contemporary dramatic convention in several ways. For example, in Shakespeare's day, plays were usually expected to follow the advice of Aristotle in his Poetics, that a drama should focus on action, not character. In Hamlet, Shakespeare reverses this, so that it is through the soliloquies, not the action, that the audience learns Hamlet's motives and thoughts. The play is full of seeming discontinuities and irregularities of action, except in the bad quarto. At one point, as in the gravedigger scene, Hamlet seems resolved to kill Claudius. In the next scene, however, when Claudius appears, he is suddenly tame. Scholars still debate whether these twists are mistakes or intentional additions to add to the play's theme of confusion and duality. Finally, in a period when most plays ran for 2 hours or so, the full text of Hamlet, Shakespeare's longest play, with 4,042 lines, totaling 29,551 words, takes over 4 hours to deliver. Even today, the play is rarely performed in its entirety, and has only once been dramatized on film completely, with Kenneth Branagh's 1996 version. Hamlet also contains a favorite Shakespearean device, a play within the play, a literary device or conceit in which one story is told during the action of another story. Section 6.3. Language. Compared with language in a modern newspaper, magazine, or popular novel, Shakespeare's language can strike contemporary readers as complex, elaborate, and at times difficult to understand. Remarkably, it still works well enough in the theatre. Audiences at the reconstruction of Shakespeare's Globe in London, many of whom have never been to the theatre before, let alone to a play by Shakespeare, seem to have little difficulty grasping the play's action. Much of Hamlet's language is courtly, elaborate, witty discourse, as recommended by Baldassare Castiglione's 1528 etiquette guide, The Courtier. This work specifically advises royal retainers to amuse their masters with inventive language. Osric and Polonius, especially, seem to respect this injunction. Claudius's speech is rich with rhetorical figures, as is Hamlet's, and at times Ophelia's, while the language of Horatio, the guards, and the gravediggers is simpler. Claudius's high status is reinforced by using the royal first-person plural, we or us, and anaphora mixed with metaphor to resonate with Greek political speeches. Hamlet is the most skilled of all at rhetoric. He uses highly developed metaphors, sticomythia, and in 9 memorable words deploys both anaphora and asyndeton. Quote, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. End quote. In contrast, when occasion demands, he is precise and straightforward, as when he explains his inward emotion to his mother. Quote, "But I have that within which passes show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe." End quote. At times, he relies heavily on puns to express his true thoughts, while simultaneously concealing them. His nunnery remarks to Ophelia are an example of a cruel double meaning, as nunnery was Elizabethan slang for brothel. His very first words in the play are a pun. When Claudius addresses him as "my cousin Hamlet and my son," Hamlet says as an aside, quote, "a little more than kin and less than kind." End quote. An aside is a dramatic device in which a character speaks to the audience. By convention, the audience realizes that the character's speech is unheard by the other characters on stage. It may be addressed to the audience expressly, in character or out, or represent an unspoken thought. An unusual rhetorical device, hendiadys, appears in several places in the play. Examples are found in Ophelia's speech at the end of the nunnery scene, quote, "The expectancy and rose of the fair state," end quote, quote, "and I of ladies most deject and wretched," end quote. Many scholars have found it odd that Shakespeare would, seemingly arbitrarily, use this rhetorical form throughout the play. One explanation may be that Hamlet was written later in Shakespeare's life, when he was adept at matching rhetorical devices to character and the plot. Linguist George T. Wright suggests that hendiadys had been used deliberately to heighten the play's sense of duality and dislocation. Pauline Kiernan argues that Shakespeare changed English drama forever in Hamlet because he, quote, "showed how a character's language can often be saying several things at once, and contradictory meanings at that, to reflect fragmented thoughts and disturbed feelings." End quote. She gives the example of Hamlet's advice to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," which is simultaneously a reference to a place of chastity and a slang term for a brothel, reflecting Hamlet's confused feelings about female sexuality. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, "Hamlet's statement that his dark clothes are the outer sign of his inner grief demonstrates strong rhetorical skill." Artist, Eugène Delacroix, 1834. Section 7. Context and Interpretation. Section 7.1. Religious. Written at a time of religious upheaval, and in the wake of the English Reformation, the play is alternately Catholic, or piously medieval, and Protestant, or consciously modern. The ghost describes himself as being in purgatory, and as dying without last rites. This and Ophelia's burial ceremony, which is characteristically Catholic, make up most of the play's Catholic connections. Some scholars have observed that revenge tragedies come from traditionally Catholic countries, such as Spain and Italy, and they present a contradiction, since according to Catholic doctrine, the strongest duty is to God and family. Hamlet's conundrum, then, is whether to avenge his father and kill Claudius, or to leave the vengeance to God, as his religion requires. Much of the play's Protestantism derives from its location in Denmark, then and now a predominantly Protestant country, though it is unclear whether the fictional Denmark of the play is intended to mirror this fact. The play does mention Wittenberg, where Hamlet, Horatio, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern attend university, and where Martin Luther first proposed his 95 Theses in 1517, effectively ushering in the Protestant Reformation. In Shakespeare's day, Denmark, as the majority of Scandinavia, was Lutheran. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, "Ophelia depicts Lady Ophelia's mysterious death by drowning." In the play, the clowns discuss whether Ophelia's death was a suicide, and whether or not she merits a Christian burial. Artist, John Everett Millais, 1852. Section 7.2. Philosophical. Hamlet is often perceived as a philosophical character, expounding ideas that are now described as relativist, existentialist, and skeptical. For example, he expresses a subjectivistic idea when he says to Rosencrantz, quote, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." End quote. The idea that nothing is real except in the mind of the individual finds its roots in the Greek sophists, who argued that since nothing can be perceived except through the senses, and since all individuals sense, and therefore perceive things differently, there is no absolute truth, only relative truth. The clearest example of existentialism is found in the "to be or not to be" speech, where Hamlet uses being to allude to both life and action, and not being to death and inaction. Hamlet's contemplation of suicide in this scene, however, is less philosophical than religious, as he believes that he will continue to exist after death. Scholars agree that Hamlet reflects the contemporary skepticism that prevailed in Renaissance humanism. Prior to Shakespeare's time, humanists had argued that man was God's greatest creation, made in God's image, and able to choose his own nature, but this view was challenged, notably in Michel de Montaigne's essay of 1590. Hamlet's "What a piece of work is man" echoes many of Montaigne's ideas, but scholars disagree whether Shakespeare drew directly from Montaigne or whether both men were simply reacting similarly to the spirit of the times. Hamlet's skepticism is juxtaposed in the play with Horatio's more traditional Christian worldview. Despite the friends' close bond, Hamlet counters Horatio's faith with the seemingly agnostic comment, quote, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." End quote. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, "Philosophical ideas in Hamlet are similar to those of the French writer Michel de Montaigne, a contemporary of Shakespeare's. Artist, Thomas de Léo, active between 1560 and 1612. Section 7.3. Psychoanalytic. In the first half of the 20th century, when psychoanalysis was at the height of its influence, its concepts were applied to Hamlet, notably by Sigmund Freud, Ernst Jones, and Jacques Lacan, and these studies influenced theatrical productions. In his The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900, Freud's analysis starts from the premise that, quote, "The play is built up on Hamlet's hesitations over fulfilling the task of revenge that is assigned to him, but its text offers no reasons or motives for these hesitations." End quote. After reviewing various literary theories, Freud concludes that Hamlet has an, quote, "Oedipal desire for his mother, and the subsequent guilt is preventing him from murdering the man, Claudius, who has done what he unconsciously wanted to do." End quote. Confronted with his repressed desires, Hamlet realizes that, quote, "He himself is literally no better than the sinner whom he is to punish." End quote. Freud suggests that Hamlet's apparent distaste for sexuality, articulated in his nunnery conversation with Ophelia, accords with this interpretation. John Barrymore introduced Freudian overtones into his landmark 1922 production in New York, which ran for a record-breaking 101 nights. Beginning in 1910, with the publication of The Oedipus Complex as an explanation of Hamlet's mystery, a study in motive, Ernst Jones, a psychoanalyst and Freud's biographer, developed Freud's ideas into a series of essays that culminated in his book Hamlet and Oedipus, 1949. Influenced by Jones's psychoanalytic approach, several productions have portrayed the closet scene, where Hamlet confronts his mother in her private quarters, in a sexual light. In this reading, Hamlet is disgusted by his mother's incestuous relationship with Claudius, while simultaneously fearful of killing him, as this would clear Hamlet's path to his mother's bed. Ophelia's madness after her father's death may also be read through the Freudian lens, as a reaction to the death of her hoped-for lover, her father. She is overwhelmed by having her unfulfilled love for him so abruptly terminated, and drifts into the oblivion of insanity. In 1937, Tyrone Guthrie directed Laurence Olivier in a Jones-inspired Hamlet at the Old Vic. Olivier later used some of these same ideas in his 1948 film version of the play. In the 1950s, Lacan's structuralist theories about Hamlet were first presented in a series of seminars given in Paris and later published in Desire and the Interpretation of Desire in Hamlet. Lacan postulated that the human psyche is determined by structures of language and that the linguistic structures of Hamlet shed light on human desire. His point of departure is Freud's Oedipal theories and the central theme of mourning that runs through Hamlet. In Lacan's analysis, Hamlet unconsciously assumes the role of phallus, the cause of his inaction, and is increasingly distanced from reality, quote, by mourning, fantasy, narcissism, and psychosis, end quote, which create holes, or lack, manque, in the real, imaginary, and symbolic aspects of his psyche. Lacan's theories influenced literary criticism of Hamlet because of his alternative vision of the play and his use of semantics to explore the play's psychological landscape. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, Freud suggested that an unconscious Oedipal conflict caused Hamlet's hesitations. Artist, Eugène Delacroix, 1844. Section 7.4. Feminist. In the early 20th century, feminist critics opened up new approaches to Gertrude and Ophelia. New historicist and cultural materialist critics examined the play in its historical context, attempting to piece together its original cultural environment. They focused on the gender system of early modern England, pointing to the common trinity of maid, wife, or widow, with whores alone outside of the stereotype. In this analysis, the essence of Hamlet is the central character's changed perception of his mother as a whore because of her failure to remain faithful to old Hamlet. In consequence, Hamlet loses his faith in all women, treating Ophelia as if she too were a whore and dishonest with Hamlet. Ophelia, by some critics, can be honest and fair. However, it is virtually impossible to link these two traits, since fairness is an outward trait, while honesty is an inward trait. Carolyn Heilbrun's 1957 essay, The Character of Hamlet's Mother, defends Gertrude, arguing that the text never hints that Gertrude knew of Claudius poisoning King Hamlet. This analysis has been championed by many feminist critics. Heilbrun argued that men have for centuries completely misrepresented Gertrude, accepting at face value Hamlet's view of her, instead of following the actual text of the play. By this account, no clear evidence suggests that Gertrude is an adulteress. She is merely adapting to the circumstances of her husband's death for the good of the kingdom. Ophelia has also been defended by feminist critics, most notably Elaine Showalter. Ophelia is surrounded by powerful men, her father, brother, and Hamlet. All three disappear. Laertes leaves, Hamlet abandons her, and Polonius dies. Conventional theories had argued that without these three powerful men making decisions for her, Ophelia is driven into madness. Feminist theorists argue that she goes mad with guilt because, when Hamlet kills her father, he has fulfilled her sexual desire to have Hamlet kill her father so they can be together. Showalter points out that Ophelia has become the symbol of the distraught and hysterical woman in modern culture. This section is accompanied by two images. The first is captioned, Ophelia is distracted by grief. Feminist critics have explored her descent into madness. Artist, Henrietta Ray, 1890. The second is captioned, Hamlet tries to show his mother Gertrude his father's ghost. Artist, Nikolai A. Abildgaard, circa 1778. Section 8. Influence. Hamlet is one of the most quoted works in the English language and is often included on lists of the world's greatest literature. As such, it reverberates through the writing of later centuries. Academic Laurie Osborne identifies the direct influence of Hamlet in numerous modern narratives and divides them into four main categories: fictional accounts of the play's composition, simplifications of the story for young readers, stories expanding the role of one or more characters, and narratives featuring performances of the play. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones published about 1749, describes a visit to Hamlet by Tom Jones and Mr. Partridge, with similarities to the play within a play. In contrast, Goethe's Bildungsroman, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, written between 1776 and 1796, not only has a production of Hamlet at its core, but also creates parallels between the ghost and Wilhelm Meister's dead father. In the early 1850s, in Pierre, Herman Melville focuses on a Hamlet-like character's long development as a writer. 10 years later, Dickens's Great Expectations contains many Hamlet-like plot elements. It is driven by revenge-motivated actions, contains ghost-like characters, Abel Magwitch and Miss Havisham, and focuses on the hero's guilt. Academic Alexander Welsh notes that Great Expectations is an, quote, autobiographical novel, end quote, and, quote, anticipates psychoanalytic readings of Hamlet itself, end quote. About the same time, George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss was published, introducing Maggie Tulliver, quote, who is explicitly compared with Hamlet, end quote, though, quote, with a reputation for sanity, end quote. In the 1920s, James Joyce managed, quote, a more upbeat version, end quote, of Hamlet, stripped of obsession and revenge, in Ulysses, though its main parallels are with Homer's Odyssey. In the 1990s, 2 women novelists were explicitly influenced by Hamlet. In Angela Carter's Wise Children, To Be or Not to Be is reworked as a song and dance routine, and Iris Murdoch's The Black Prince has Oedipal themes and murder intertwined with the love affair between a Hamlet-obsessed writer, Bradley Pearson, and the daughter of his rival. Quote, there is the story of the woman who read Hamlet for the first time and said, I don't see why people admire that play so. It is nothing but a bunch of quotations strung together. End quote. Isaac Asimov, Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, page Roman 7, Avenal Books, 1970. Section 9. Performance History. This section is accompanied by a box containing a quote from Maurice Maeterlinck, 1890. Quote, the day we see Hamlet die in the theater, something of him dies for us. He is dethroned by the spectre of an actor, and we shall never be able to keep the usurper out of our dreams. End quote. Section 9.1. Shakespeare's Day to the Interregnum. Shakespeare almost certainly wrote the role of Hamlet for Richard Burbage. He was the chief tragedian of the Lord Chamberlain's men, with a capacious memory for lines and a wide emotional range. Judging by the number of reprints, Hamlet appears to have been Shakespeare's 4th most popular play during his lifetime. Only Henry IV, Part 1, Richard III, and Pericles eclipsed it. Shakespeare provides no clear indication of when his play is set. However, as Elizabethan actors performed at the Globe in contemporary dress on minimal sets, this would not have affected the staging. Firm evidence for specific early performances of the play is scant. What is known is that the crew of the ship Red Dragon, anchored off Sierra Leone, performed Hamlet in September 1607, that the play toured in Germany within 5 years of Shakespeare's death, and that it was performed before James I in 1619 and Charles I in 1637. Oxford editor George Hibbard argues that, since the contemporary literature contains many allusions and references to Hamlet, only Falstaff is mentioned more from Shakespeare, the play was surely performed with a frequency that the historical record misses. All theaters were closed down by the Puritan government during the interregnum. During this time, however, playlets known as drolls were often performed illegally, including the one called The Gravemakers, based on Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet. Section 9.2. Restoration in the 18th Century. The play was revived early in the Restoration, when the existing stock of pre-Civil War plays was divided between the 2 newly created patent theater companies. Hamlet was the only Shakespearean favorite that Sir William Davenant's Duke's Company secured. It became the first of Shakespeare's plays to be presented with movable flats painted with generic scenery behind the proscenium arch of Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre. This new stage convention highlighted the frequency with which Shakespeare shifts dramatic location, encouraging the recurrent criticisms of his violation of the neoclassical principle of maintaining a unity of place. Davenant cast Thomas Betterton in the eponymous role, and he continued to play the Dane until he was 74. David Garrick at Drury Lane produced a version that adapted Shakespeare heavily. He declared, quote, "I had sworn I would not leave the stage till I had rescued that noble play from all the rubbish of the fifth act. I have brought it forth without the gravedigger's trick, Osric and the fencing match." End quote. The first actor known to have played Hamlet in North America is Lewis Hallam, Jr., in the American Company's production in Philadelphia in 1759. John Philip Kemble made his Drury Lane debut as Hamlet in 1783. His performance was said to be 20 minutes longer than anyone else's, and his lengthy pauses provoked the suggestion that, quote, "music should be played between the words." End quote. Sarah Siddons was the first actress known to play Hamlet. Many women have since played him as a breeches role, to great acclaim. In 1748, Alexander Sumarokov wrote a Russian adaptation that focused on Prince Hamlet as the embodiment of an opposition to Claudius's tyranny, a treatment that would recur in Eastern European versions into the 20th century. In the years following America's independence, Thomas Apthorpe Cooper, the young nation's leading tragedian, performed Hamlet among other plays at the Chestnut Street Theatre in Philadelphia and at the Park Theatre in New York. Although chided for, quote, "acknowledging acquaintances in the audience," end quote, and, quote, "inadequate memorization of his lines," end quote, he became a national celebrity. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, "David Garrick's iconic hand gesture expresses Hamlet's shock at the first sight of the ghost. Artist unknown." Section 9.3, 19th century. From around 1810 to 1840, the best-known Shakespearean performances in the United States were tours by leading London actors, including George Frederick Cook, Junius Brutus Booth, Edmund Kean, William Charles Macready, and Charles Kemble. Of these, Booth remained to make his career in the States, fathering the nation's most notorious actor, John Wilkes Booth, who later assassinated Abraham Lincoln, and its most famous Hamlet, Edwin Booth. Edwin Booth's Hamlet was described as, quote, "like the dark, mad, dreamy, mysterious hero of a poem, ellipsis, acted in an ideal manner, as far removed as possible from the plane of actual life." End quote. Booth played Hamlet for 100 nights in the 1864-65 season at the Winter Garden Theatre, inaugurating the era of long-run Shakespeare in America. In the United Kingdom, the actor-managers of the Victorian era, including Kean, Samuel Phelps, Macready, and Henry Irving, staged Shakespeare in a grand manner, with elaborate scenery and costumes. The tendency of actor-managers to emphasize the importance of their own central character did not always meet with the critics' approval. George Bernard Shaw's praise for Johnston Forbes Robertson's performance contains a sideswipe at Irving. Quote, "The story of the play was perfectly intelligible, and quite took the attention of the audience off the principal actor at moments. What is the Lyceum coming to?" End quote. In London, Edmund Kean was the first Hamlet to abandon the regal finery usually associated with the role in favor of a plain costume, and he is said to have surprised his audience by playing Hamlet as serious and introspective. In stark contrast to earlier opulence, William Pole's 1881 production of the Q1 text was an early attempt at reconstructing the Elizabethan theater's austerity. His only backdrop was a set of red curtains. Sarah Bernhardt played the prince in her popular 1899 London production. In contrast to the effeminate view of the central character that usually accompanied a female casting, she described her character as, quote, "manly and resolute, but nonetheless thoughtful, ellipsis. He thinks before he acts, a trait indicative of great strength and great spiritual power." End quote. In France, Charles Kemble initiated an enthusiasm for Shakespeare, and leading members of the Romantic movement such as Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas saw his 1827 Paris performance of Hamlet, particularly admiring the madness of Harriet Smithson's Ophelia. In Germany, Hamlet had become so assimilated by the mid-19th century that Ferdinand Freiligrath declared that, quote, "Germany is Hamlet." End quote. From the 1950s, the Parsi theater tradition in India transformed Hamlet into folk performances, with dozens of songs added. This section is accompanied by an image captioned, "A poster, circa 1884, for an American production of Hamlet, starring Thomas W. Keane, showing several of the key scenes." Section 9.4, 20th Century. Apart from some Western troops' 19th century visits, the first professional performance of Hamlet in Japan was Otojiro Kawakami's 1903 Shimpa, New School Theater, adaptation. Shoyo Tsubuchi translated Hamlet and produced a performance in 1911 that blended Shingeki, New Drama, and Kabuki styles. This hybrid genre reached its peak in Fukuda Tsuneyari's 1955 Hamlet. In 1998, Yukio Ninagawa produced an acclaimed version of Hamlet in the style of No theater, which he took to London. Konstantin Stanislavski and Edward Gordon Craig, two of the 20th century's most influential theater practitioners, collaborated on the Moscow Art Theater's seminal production of 1911 to 1912. While Craig favored stylized abstraction, Stanislavski, armed with his system, explored psychological motivation. Craig conceived of the play as a symbolist monodrama, offering a dreamlike vision as seen through Hamlet's eyes alone. This was most evident in the staging of the first court scene. The most famous aspect of the production is Craig's use of large abstract screens that altered the size and shape of the acting area for each scene, representing the character's state of mind spatially or visualizing a dramaturgical progression. The production attracted enthusiastic and unprecedented worldwide attention for the theater and placed it, quote, "on the cultural map for Western Europe." End quote. Hamlet is often played with contemporary political overtones. Leopold Gessner's 1926 production at the Berlin Staatstheater portrayed Claudius's court as a parody of the corrupt and fawning court of Kaiser Wilhelm. In Poland, the number of productions of Hamlet has tended to increase at times of political unrest, since its political themes, suspected crimes, coups, surveillance, can be used to comment on a contemporary situation. Similarly, Czech directors have used the play at times of occupation. A 1941 Vinohrady theater production, quote, emphasized, with due caution, the helpless situation of an intellectual attempting to endure in a ruthless environment. End quote. In China, performances of Hamlet often have political significance. Gu Wuwei's 1916 The Usurper of State Power, an amalgam of Hamlet and Macbeth, was an attack on Yuan Shikai's attempt to overthrow the Republic. In 1942, Jiao Juyin directed the play in a Confucian temple in Sichuan province, to which the government had retreated from the advancing Japanese. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the protests at Tiananmen Square, Lin Zhaohua staged a 1990 Hamlet in which the prince was an ordinary individual tortured by a loss of meaning. In this production, the actors playing Hamlet, Claudius, and Polonius exchanged roles at crucial moments in the performance, including the moment of Claudius's death, at which point the actor mainly associated with Hamlet fell to the ground. Notable stagings in London and New York include Barrymore's 1925 production at the Haymarket. It influenced subsequent performances by John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier. Gielgud played the central role many times. His 1936 New York production ran for 136 performances, leading to the accolade that he was, quote, the finest interpreter of the role since Barrymore, end quote, although, quote, "Posterity has treated Maurice Evans less kindly," end quote. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, he was regarded by many as the leading interpreter of Shakespeare in the United States, and in the 1938-39 season, he presented Broadway's first uncut Hamlet, running 4.5 hours. Olivier's 1937 performance at the Old Vic Theatre was popular with audiences but not with critics, with James Agate writing in a famous review in the Sunday Times, quote, "Mr. Olivier does not speak poetry badly. He does not speak it at all." End quote. In 1937, Tyrone Guthrie directed the play at Elsinore, Denmark, with Laurence Olivier as Hamlet and Vivien Leigh as Ophelia. In 1963, Olivier directed Peter O'Toole as Hamlet in the inaugural performance of the newly formed National Theatre. Critics found resonance between O'Toole's Hamlet and John Osborne's hero, Jimmy Porter, from Look Back in Anger. Richard Burton received his third Tony Award nomination when he played his second Hamlet, his first under John Gielgud's direction, in 1964 in a production that holds the record for the longest run of the play in Broadway history, 136 performances. The performance was set on a bare stage, conceived to appear like a dress rehearsal, with Burton in a black V-neck sweater, and Gielgud himself tape-recorded the voice for the ghost, which appeared as a looming shadow. It was immortalized both on record and on a film that played in U.S. theaters for a week in 1964, as well as being the subject of books written by cast members William Redfield and Richard L. Stern. Other New York portrayals of Hamlet of note include that of Ralph Fiennes in 1995, for which he won the Tony Award for Best Actor, which ran, from first preview to closing night, a total of 100 performances. About the Fiennes Hamlet, Vincent Canby wrote in the New York Times that it was, quote, "not one for literary sleuths and Shakespeare scholars. It respects the play, but it doesn't provide any new material for arcane debates on what it all means. Instead, it's an intelligent, beautifully read, ellipsis." End quote. Stacy Keach played the role with an all-star cast at Joseph Papp's Delacorte Theatre in the early 70s, with Colleen Dewhurst's Gertrude, James Earl Jones's King, Barnard Hughes's Polonius, Sam Waterston's Laertes, and Raul Julia's Osric. Sam Waterston later played the role himself at the Delacorte for the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the show transferred to the Vivian Beaumont Theatre in 1975. Stephen Lang played Bernardo and other roles. Stephen Lang's Hamlet for the Roundabout Theatre Company in 1992 received positive reviews and ran for 61 performances. David Warner played the role with the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in 1965. William Hurt at Circle Rep off-Broadway, memorably performing To Be or Not to Be while lying on the floor, John Voight at Rutgers, and Christopher Walken, fiercely, at Stratford, Connecticut, have all played the role, as has Diane Venora at the Public Theater. Off-Broadway, the Riverside Shakespeare Company mounted an uncut First Folio Hamlet in 1978 at Columbia University, with a playing time of under 3 hours. In fact, Hamlet is the most produced Shakespeare play in New York theater history, with 64 recorded productions on Broadway and an untold number off-Broadway. Ian Charleson performed Hamlet from the 9th of October to the 13th of November, 1989, in Richard Eyre's production at the Olivier Theatre, replacing Daniel Day-Lewis, who had abandoned the production. Seriously ill from AIDS at the time, Charleston died 8 weeks after his last performance. Fellow actor and friend, Sir Ian McKellen, said that Charleson played Hamlet so well it was as if he had rehearsed the role all his life. McKellen called it, quote, "the perfect Hamlet," end quote. The performance garnered other major accolades as well, some critics echoing McKellen in calling it the definitive Hamlet performance. This section is accompanied by 2 images. The first is captioned, "In 1908, Edward Gordon Craig designed the MAT production of Hamlet, 1911 to 1912. The isolated figure of Hamlet reclines in the dark foreground, while behind a gauze the rest of the court are absorbed in a bright, unified golden pyramid emanating from Claudius. Craig's famous screens are flat against the back in this scene. The second is captioned, Mignon, Nevada, as Ophelia, 1910. Section 9.5, 21st Century. In May 2009, Hamlet opened with Jude Law in the title role at the Donmar Warehouse West End season at Wyndham's Theatre. The production officially opened on the 3rd of June and ran through the 22nd of August 2009. A further production of the play ran at Elsinore Castle in Denmark from the 25th to 30th of August 2009. The Jude Law Hamlet then moved to Broadway and ran for 12 weeks at the Broadhurst Theatre in New York. Section 9.6, Screen Performances. The earliest screen success for Hamlet was Sarah Bernhardt's 5-minute film of the fencing scene, produced in 1900. The film was a crude talkie in that music and words were recorded on phonograph records to be played along with the film. Silent versions were released in 1907, 1908, 1910, 1913, 1917, and 1920. In the 1920 version, Asta Nielsen played Hamlet as a woman who spends her life disguised as a man. Laurence Olivier's 1948 moody black-and-white Hamlet won Best Picture and Best Actor Oscars, and is still, as of 2011, the only Shakespeare film to have done so. His interpretation stressed the Oedipal overtones of the play, and cast 28-year-old Eileen Hurley as Hamlet's mother, opposite himself, at 41, as Hamlet. Shakespeare experts Sir John Gielgud and Kenneth Branagh consider the definitive rendition of the bard's tragic tale to be the 1964 Russian film Gamlet, based on a translation by Boris Pasternak and directed by Grigory Kozintsev, with a score by Dmitry Shostakovich. Inokenti Smoktunovsky was cast in the role of Hamlet. He was particularly praised by Sir Laurence Olivier. John Gielgud directed Richard Burton in a Broadway production at the Lunt-Fontanne Theatre in 1964-65, the longest-running Hamlet in the U.S. to date. A live film of the production was produced using electronovision, a method of recording a live performance with multiple video cameras and converting the image to film. Eileen Hurley repeated her role from Olivier's film version as the Queen, and the voice of Gielgud was heard as the Ghost. The Gielgud-Burton production was also recorded complete and released on LP by Columbia Records. The first Hamlet in color was a 1969 film directed by Tony Richardson, with Nicole Williamson as Hamlet and Marianne Faithfull as Ophelia. In 1990, Franco Zeffirelli, whose Shakespeare films have been described as, quote, sensual rather than cerebral, end quote, cast Mel Gibson, then famous for the Mad Max and Lethal Weapon movies, in the title role of his 1990 version, and Glenn Close, then famous as the psychotic other woman in Fatal Attraction, as Gertrude. In contrast to Zeffirelli, whose Hamlet was heavily cut, Kenneth Branagh adapted, directed, and starred in a 1996 version containing every word of Shakespeare's play, combining the material from the F1 and Q2 texts. Branagh's Hamlet runs for around 4 hours. Branagh set the film with late 19th century costuming and furnishings, and Blenheim Palace, built in the early 18th century, became Elsinore Castle in the exterior scenes. The film is structured as an epic, and makes frequent use of flashbacks to highlight elements not made explicit in the play. Hamlet's sexual relationship with Kate Winslet's Ophelia, for example, or his childhood affection for Yorick, played by Ken Dodd. In 2000, Michael Almereda's Hamlet set the story in contemporary Manhattan, with Ethan Hawke playing Hamlet as a film student. Claudius, played by Kyle MacLachlan, became the CEO of Denmark Corporation, having taken over the company by killing his brother. Notable made-for-television productions of Hamlet include those starring Christopher Plummer, 1964, Richard Chamberlain, 1970, Hallmark Hall of Fame, Derek Jacobi, 1980, Royal Shakespeare Company, BBC, Kevin Kline, 1990, Campbell Scott, 2000, and David Tennant, 2009, Royal Shakespeare Company, BBC. There have also been several films that transposed the general storyline of Hamlet or elements thereof to other settings. There have also been many films which included performances of scenes from Hamlet as a play within a film. See Hamlet on Screen, adaptations, and Hamlet on Screen, theatrical performances, within films for further details. This section is accompanied by an image with the caption, Sarah Bernhardt as Hamlet, with Yorick's skull, photographer James Lafayette, circa 1885 to 1900. Section 10. Stage pastiches. There have been various derivative works of Hamlet which recast the story from the point of view of other characters, or transpose the story into a new setting or act as sequels or prequels to Hamlet. This section is limited to those written for the stage. The best known is Tom Stoppard's 1966 play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which retells many of the events of the story from the point of view of the characters Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, as well as giving them a backstory of their own. The play was nominated for 8 Tony Awards and won 4, Best Play, Scenic and Costume Design, and Producer. The director and the 3 leading actors were nominated but did not win. It also won Best Play from the New York Drama Critics Circle in 1968, and Outstanding Production from the Outer Critics Circle in 1969. Several times since 1995, the American Shakespeare Center has mounted repertoires that included both Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, with the same actors performing the same roles in each. In their 2001 and 2009 seasons, the 2 plays were, quote, directed, designed, and rehearsed together to make the most out of the shared scenes and situations, end quote. Lee Blessing's Fortinbras is a comical sequel to Hamlet, in which all the deceased characters come back as ghosts. The New York Times reviewed the play, saying it is, quote, scarcely more than an extended comedy sketch, lacking the portent and linguistic complexity of Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Fortinbras operates on a far less ambitious plane, but it is a ripping yarn and offers Keith Redden a role in which he can commit comic mayhem, end quote. Heiner Müller's cutting-edge drama, The Hamlet Machine, was first produced in Paris by director Jean Jourdhuil in 1979 and swiftly became a classic of postmodern drama. This play in turn inspired Giannina Brasci's dramatic novel United States of Banana, which takes place at the Statue of Liberty in post-9/11 New York City. In it, Hamlet, Zarathustra, and Giannina are on a quest to free the Puerto Rican prisoner Sigismundo from the Dungeon of Liberty, where Sigismundo's father, Basilio, the King of the United States of Banana, imprisoned him for the crime of having been born. The work intertwines the plots and characters of Calderon de la Barca's Life is a Dream with Shakespeare's Hamlet. Caridad Svitch's 12 Ophelias, a play with broken songs, includes elements of the story of Hamlet, but focuses on Ophelia. In Svitch's play, Ophelia is resurrected and rises from a pool of water after her death in Hamlet. The play is a series of scenes and songs, and was first staged at a public swimming pool in Brooklyn. Heidi Weiss of the Chicago Sun-Times said of the play, quote, far more surreal and twisted than Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, 12 Ophelias is a reminder of just how morphable and mysterious Shakespeare's original remains, end quote. Other characters are renamed. Hamlet is Rude Boy. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are androgynous helpers simply known as R and G. Gertrude is the madam of a brothel. Horatio becomes H and continues to be Hamlet's best friend/confidant, and a chorus of Ophelias serves as guide. A new character, Mina, is introduced, and she is a whore in Gertrude's brothel. Section 11. References. Section 11.1. Notes. Section 11.2. Editions of Hamlet. Section 11.3. Secondary sources. There are references available in the written form of this article. Please be sure to verify information found on Wikipedia using the references provided, or by cross-referencing the information yourself. Section 12. External links. External links have been provided for finding additional information online. This is the end of the spoken article, Hamlet. This sound file and all text in the article are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 Unported license, available at creativecommons.org.